My husband of 3 years shattered my world with one demand, a paternity test, just weeks after our son was born. His accusation? That I had been unfaithful with his own brother, igniting a wildfire of chaos within our family. I'm 29, a new mother barely 3 weeks postpartum, living under the strained roof of my in-laws after a brutal fight with my husband, Michael, who's 32. It all began 2 weeks after our son arrived, when Michael blindsided me with his suspicion. He believed our child wasn't his but his brother's. The word stung, leaving me breathless, my mind racing to make sense of his sudden doubt. For context, Brian, Michael's brother, also 29, and I go way back. We met in college, clicked instantly, and remained close ever since. Funny thing is, I met Michael through Brian. That connection always felt serendipitous, not suspicious. So why now? Why this insecurity boiling over like a hidden fault line finally erupting? My parents live in Iowa. College took me to Buffalo, where Brian was just a short drive away. In my freshman year, drowning in homesickness, he invited me to his place. That's when I met Michael for the first time. We exchanged numbers, casual at first, and didn't reconnect until after graduation. Friendship blossomed into romance, and 4 years later, we said our vows. 3 years of marriage, solid, happy, intertwined with laughter and shared dreams. Brian remained a constant friend, and Michael never batted an eye. The three of us were a trio, often hanging out without an ounce of tension. But something shifted when I reached my 8th month of pregnancy. Michael grew distant, retreating into long work hours and silence. I chalked it up to nerves about becoming a dad. I reassured him, whispered that he'd be an amazing father, but my words slid off him like rain on glass. Eventually, I stopped trying, focusing instead on my health and the baby, hoping things would right themselves after the birth. They didn't. Michael kept his distance, avoiding both me and our newborn son. He always had an excuse, work, exhaustion, anything but facing us. Days blurred into weeks, his absence growing heavier until I snapped. One evening, as he dragged himself through the door, I cornered him. No more sidestepping. I needed answers. What's wrong with you? I demanded, my voice shaking from exhaustion and bottled-up frustration. He fed me the same tired line, work stress, nothing personal. But I wasn't buying it. My heart couldn't take the ache of his detachment any longer. If you can't be honest with me, I don't know how we can keep doing this, I said, the words sharp, laced with pain. That's when he cracked. His eyes darkened, and he confessed he didn't believe our son was his. He thought I'd been sleeping with Brian, that our baby was the product of betrayal. I erupted. Weeks of postpartum hormones, exhaustion, and now this baseless accusation? I screamed until my throat burned, tears blinding me. His words weren't just an accusation, they were a betrayal of everything we had built. But Michael didn't flinch. He stood there, emotionless, claiming my outburst proved his suspicions. Then he tried to leave the room. No. He didn't get to drop a bomb like that and walk away. I blocked his path, demanding an explanation. That's when he told me about the dinner party weeks ago. We had a few of my college friends over, laughter filling the house. Michael overheard Brian chatting with an old friend, reminiscing about college days. They joked that everyone had expected Brian and me to end up together because we were so close. Brian laughed it off. Apparently, that was the smoking gun. Michael was hurt because Brian hadn't defended him. Defended him from what? A harmless college memory? Nostalgic chatter that meant nothing? I tried to make him see reason. It was just small talk, I argued, my voice raw. You're my husband. That should be enough. But it wasn't. Michael clung to his delusion, insisting he wouldn't speak to me until I proved our son was his. A paternity test, or silence. Under normal circumstances, maybe I wouldn't have cared. But this? This was absurd, humiliating. His mistrust cut deeper than any blade. Furious and heartbroken, I packed a bag, cradled my baby, and left. Michael didn't stop me. Not a word, not a glance. But once I was out, reality hit hard. Where could I go? Friends would ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. Brian's place was out of the question. It would only feed Michael's paranoia. With nowhere else to turn, I found myself at the doorstep of the very people connected to this mess, my in-laws. With nowhere else to turn, I made my way to my in-laws' house, clutching the fragile hope that they might be my refuge. They'd always seemed to like me, and after Michael, they were the safest harbor I could imagine. The day I left him, I wandered aimlessly through streets that felt both suffocatingly familiar and eerily foreign, until finally, I stood at their doorstep. They welcomed me in without hesitation, their arms a silent promise of safety. When I unraveled the story of why Michael and I had been fighting, their expressions shifted from warmth to disbelief, then to a quiet, embarrassed sadness. They apologized for him, voices low and heavy with disappointment. But there was confusion too. This wasn't Michael. His behavior felt like an ill-fitting mask. Insecurity over Brian? It didn't make sense. The brothers had always been close, immune to the petty rivalries that frayed other families. I agreed. It was like watching a stranger wear Michael's face. Despite the bewilderment, his parents made one thing clear: I was welcome to stay as long as I needed. They supported me, no matter what decision I made about Michael, even if that meant divorce. Their words were fragile comfort, like a lifeline fraying at the edges. They promised to help, to make Michael see reason, to pull an apology from him that wasn't just hollow words but genuine remorse. They tried. For days, they pleaded with him, their patience thinning like worn fabric. By the third day, frustration overtook them. They told me they were cutting him off until he stopped acting like a fool. This wasn't an empty threat. Michael was poised to inherit their family-owned textile business in a few months. Their retirement was imminent, and he was their chosen successor. But if they disowned him, Brian would inherit instead. Brian, who had no interest in running the business, would likely sell it, leaving Michael with nothing. But it was all a calculated bluff. They had no real intention of handing the business to Brian. They built their lives around it and wouldn't risk its future over this mess. Their plan was simple: make Michael believe he was losing everything, so he'd come to his senses, apologize, and face me. Whether we reconciled or divorced, they just wanted him to confront the damage he'd done. I was grateful. Their support was the only thing holding me together. I couldn't confide in friends, and Brian was out of the question. This chaos was too tangled with him. Michael's parents were my lifeline. When they finally told Michael they were cutting him off, we expected him to call me immediately. But he didn't. A day passed. Then another. When he finally called, my heart raced with a fragile blend of hope and dread. I braced for an apology. Instead, his voice exploded through the phone, raw and jagged with fury. He accused me of manipulating his parents, scheming to hand the business to Brian so we could both profit. According to him, Brian was my lover now. His words, drenched in venom and heartbreak, hit me like shards of glass. Beneath the rage, I heard the cracks in his voice, the strain of suppressed sobs, and guilt twisted in my chest. He called me heartless, accused me of betrayal, of cheating him out of both his business and his baby. Desperation seeped through his rage. When I finally managed to get a word in, I told him the truth: his parents were bluffing. They had no intention of giving the business to Brian. It was all a ruse to make him talk to me. Silence. For a heartbeat, I thought I'd broken through. But then his voice returned, colder than before. "You're evil incarnate," he spat. He accused me of turning his own parents against him, of punishing him for daring to question the baby's paternity. His words carved deep, filled with a bitterness that left me trembling. I tried to reason with him, to remind him of who we were before all this. But he wouldn't hear it. He demanded a paternity test, framing it as the only logical solution. He called me manipulative, insisted I was wasting our time with arguments when the answer was simple. Now, I feel lost, adrift in a sea of accusations and shattered trust. I don't know what to do anymore. Update 1. I decided against the paternity test. Instead, I filed for divorce. The past week has been a whirlwind, each day more surreal than the last. First, thank you to everyone who shared advice and support. It meant more than I can say. After that last phone call, I sat down with Michael's parents. I told them their plan had backfired spectacularly. Instead of bringing Michael back to his senses, it had pushed him further into paranoia and resentment. I told them about his accusations, about how he believed I was manipulating them. They listened, their faces shadowed with sadness. But they reassured me. They were glad to have me in their lives, not just because I carried their grandchild, but because they'd known me for years. I was family. I had been long before this nightmare began. Since I'd moved away from my own parents for Michael, they felt it was their duty to care for me, to protect me when he wouldn't. Hearing those words felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. I wasn't as alone as I thought. Their support gave me the strength to reach out to my own parents and, finally, to Brian. My in-laws didn't want to be my only anchor in this storm. They wanted me to have more voices, more people holding me up. And so, here I am. Standing on the edge of something new, terrified but no longer alone. When I confided in my parents about Michael's accusations, their support was unwavering. They assured me that no matter what decision I made, they would stand by me. Yet, I couldn't ignore the weight of our son in all this. No one explicitly told me to leave Michael, despite his blatant irrationality, simply because of our child. It hurts to admit, but having a child with Michael complicated everything. I had to consider our son's future before making any drastic decisions. Then came the hardest conversation of all, talking to Brian. I recounted Michael's accusations, probing about the conversation he'd overheard. Brian's discomfort was palpable, his eyes darting, his posture stiffening. It hit me then, both he and Michael knew more than they let on. I pressed him, unwilling to let the matter slide, certain he was hiding something. Michael's sudden suspicion couldn't have stemmed from something so trivial. Many had suggested that Michael might be concealing something, and it began to make sense. After years of being fine with my friendship with Brian, why the sudden shift? There had to be more beneath the surface. Brian finally broke under pressure, and his confession left me seething with disbelief. Apparently, when Michael overheard their conversation, he didn't just catch the joke, he heard what followed. Brian had told his friend that he'd always thought we'd end up together after college, but life had other plans, and Michael got in the way. That was the real trigger. Michael wasn't just upset about the laughter, he was furious over Brian's hidden feelings. Michael confronted Brian immediately after overhearing this, catching him off guard. Their friend, who had been part of the conversation, quietly slipped away and never mentioned it to me, something I could forgive since we weren't particularly close. But Brian's confession stung. He admitted he harbored feelings for me, waiting until graduation to ask me out, respecting my no-dating rule. But fate had other ideas, and I ended up with Michael instead. Brian claimed he buried his feelings to preserve our happiness, and remarkably, I never had a clue, nor did Michael. Brian begged Michael to keep this secret, fearing it would ruin our friendship. Michael honored that promise, but it festered within him. His trust in me eroded, even though he never voiced it. Instead of addressing it, he let paranoia take root. After that party, it worsened, but bound by his word, he never confronted me. His suspicion grew toxic, manifesting in baseless accusations and, eventually, the demand for a paternity test. I can't fathom Michael's thought process during those weeks. Covering for his brother instead of clearing the air with me was absurd. It defied logic. This secrecy, this spiraling doubt, left our marriage beyond repair. Divorce was my only option. I cut ties with Brian, but his parents took me in. They felt responsible for the mess their sons created, offering me a place to stay and even securing a lawyer. Their support has been my anchor amid the chaos, helping me navigate the wreckage left behind. Gratitude fills me when I think of my in-laws, truly remarkable people, rare gems in a world often shadowed by complexity. Yet, despite their unwavering kindness, I've decided to file for divorce. Soon, Michael will be served. We haven't exchanged a word since that call, the one where his voice, cold and distant, insisted a paternity test was the only way to untangle our problems. I doubt he ever saw this coming. I'd never spoken of divorce before, clinging foolishly to the hope that we could repair what was already shattered. How naive I was. There's no mending this. Not now. His behavior has spiraled beyond reason, and I can't allow that toxicity to seep into my life, not when I'm navigating the fragile, sleepless world of new motherhood. If he chooses to stand by his brother, casting me as the traitor, accusing me of an affair with Brian, rather than sit down and face the truth with me, then he forfeits the right to call himself a husband or a father. Let him be the loyal brother, the dutiful son. I'll handle the rest because, clearly, the family we built holds less weight for him than the one he was born into. Update 2. Today, Michael was served. His shock was almost palpable, even over the phone. He called me, disbelief thick in his voice, asking if I was truly ending our marriage instead of taking the easy way out with a paternity test. I told him plainly that I knew why he was so rattled, because I'd spoken to Brian. I knew the truth. I didn't hold back. I told him he was out of his mind for covering for Brian instead of confronting me like an adult. His defense? He had sworn to Brian he wouldn't tell me, afraid it would wreck our friendship. So I asked him, was keeping that promise worth the ruin of our marriage? Without a hint of hesitation, he said yes. He owed Brian that much, he claimed. And yet, in the same breath, he admitted he couldn't shake the suspicion that something had happened between me and Brian. He confessed he hadn't confronted Brian because he feared he'd never get the truth. Brian had buried his feelings for so long, why would he be honest now? And he couldn't ask me, bound by his sacred promise. So he stewed in silence, letting his doubts fester until they consumed him. The day I confronted him, demanding answers, was the final crack. He said my reaction only fueled his fears. If I had nothing to hide, why resist the test? I tried to make him see, it was never about hiding anything. It was about the gut-wrenching betrayal of being doubted by the man I loved. Even after filing for divorce, I needed him to understand his blind loyalty to his brother cost him everything. The irony? He wasn't even speaking to Brian anymore. So what was it all for? But Michael wouldn't hear it. He clung to the belief that this was my fault, that I should have just agreed to the test, as if that would magically erase the damage. He claimed I should have been more understanding of his tough position, as if his emotional turmoil justified the wreckage he left behind. He insisted that recognizing his struggle and easing his mind with the test would have solved everything. The conversation was like screaming into the void. Eventually, I gave up. He was too wrapped in his own insecurities to see the wreckage he caused. To him, a promise to his brother outweighed the vows he made to me, the responsibilities he owed to our child. And yet, he suspected this same brother could be our son's father. The contradiction is staggering. Even now, tears blur my vision, not from heartbreak, but from the sheer absurdity of it all. If I'm honest, I think something is fundamentally broken in Michael. No rational person behaves this way. If the roles were reversed, if I suspected Brian had feelings for me, I would never have made such a promise. My loyalty would lie with my family, the one I chose, the one I created. Even if I had made that promise, I wouldn't let it poison my marriage. The fact that he demanded a paternity test, not from evidence but from irrational fear, cuts deeper than any betrayal. Even now, every conversation circles back to his feelings, his doubts, his guilt. Not once has he asked about our son. Not once. And that hurts more than all his accusations combined. When this chapter closes, my son might grow up without a father. Not because of anything I did, but because two brothers let their issues implode everything around them. And somehow, my son and I are left to pick up the pieces. It's not fair. It never will be. But this is the life we have now. My parents are flying in within the next couple of days to see me. Things have spiraled beyond what I could have imagined. Michael's parents still refuse to speak to either of their sons. The tension has grown so thick, they're even contemplating cutting both of them off completely. Their disappointment runs deep, so deep they're considering handing over the family business to one of their employees instead of Michael. Honestly, I believe they should cut Michael off. He's earned that much. But Brian? I'm not so sure. He hasn't done anything unforgivable. All he did was tell Michael the truth for once. It was Michael who let that truth fester, twisting it into something destructive, unraveling his own marriage. That's not Brian's burden to carry. Still, it's their decision to make, not mine. I won't interfere. What matters to me is that they've stood up for me. Maybe it's partly because they want to maintain a connection with their grandson after the divorce. But despite everything, I hold on to my love and respect for them. They've gone above and beyond, doing more than I ever expected to ease my struggles. Without their support, I don't think I would have found the strength to stand tall and file for divorce. It's wild, isn't it? The way they've backed me, even when it meant standing against their own son. Update 3. Michael isn't contesting the divorce. He doesn't even want custody of our son, no matter the paternity. That's the reality now. It doesn't surprise me, but it still stings. At least I understand his behavior a little better now. A few days ago, he reached out to his parents and told them he'd seen a psychologist shortly after I moved out. They conducted a thorough psychological evaluation and medical exam. The diagnosis? A severe anxiety disorder. It was recent, confirmed after multiple sessions with the doctors. The news hit like a jolt. Michael had never shown any signs of mental illness before. So, is this new? Or were there signs we all missed? It's hard to say. Given everything that's come to light about Michael and Brian lately, I'm starting to wonder if I ever truly knew them at all. Despite his condition, I find no reason to forgive him. His mental state might explain his actions, but it doesn't excuse them. It doesn't give him the right to hurt me, to say what he wants without a shred of accountability. The least he could have done was tell me himself. But no, he told his parents. That's how I found out. As if that wasn't enough, he's been fired from his job. He disappeared for a week straight after I left, didn't even bother to show up. Now he's scrambling, needing money for rent. That's partly why he contacted his parents in the first place. At first, I thought he might be lying about the anxiety disorder, just another excuse. But he had all the medical documents to prove it. It's real. This is happening. In some twisted way, maybe it's better this way. Better that he stays away from me and our son until he gets better, if he ever does. The divorce proceedings start in just a few days. My parents are already here, and we're all staying together in my in-laws' house. They've been gracious enough to open their doors to my family, even now. I just hope everything settles soon, that I can find a sliver of normalcy in the mess my life has become.